Everyone laughed when she shoved my head into the cake. They thought it was a joke. But when I stood up and revealed what I'd found out about her, the whole room went silent. I should have trusted my instincts the moment I saw her rifling through my late husband's desk drawer that rainy Tuesday morning 6 months ago. She claimed she was just looking for a pen to write down our family recipe for apple pie, but something about the way her fingers moved through those papers, careful and deliberate, made my stomach clench with the kind of dread I hadn't felt since the night James died. Sarah had been dating my son Michael for 8 months by then, and everyone in the family adored her. Everyone, except me. I stood in the doorway watching her, my coffee growing cold in my hands, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. After all, what 26-year-old woman wouldn't be curious about the family she was marrying into? But when she quickly closed the drawer and turned around with that bright smile of hers, I knew I'd caught her doing something she shouldn't have been doing. "Oh, Mrs. Henderson, you startled me," she laughed. That musical laugh that made Michael's face light up like Christmas morning. "I was just looking for something to write with. You know how scattered I get when I'm excited about cooking." I nodded and smiled back, the way I'd been trained to do since I was a little girl in Alabama, but my mind was racing. James's desk drawer contained nothing but old insurance papers and property deeds. Nothing that had anything to do with cooking. Nothing that an outsider should have been interested in. That was the first red flag, though I didn't call it that then. I called it a misunderstanding. I called it wedding jitters. I called it everything except what it was, the beginning of the worst 18 months of my life. You have to understand something about my family. We've lived on this same piece of land in rural Georgia for 4 generations. My great-grandmother built the original farmhouse with her own hands after her husband died in World War I, and every woman in our family since then has added something to it. My grandmother added the wraparound porch. My mother built the sunroom where I spent countless afternoons teaching Michael and his sister Emma how to can peaches and preserve the family stories that came with each recipe. I added the kitchen garden and the root cellar where I store the ingredients for our traditional wedding cake. A recipe that's been passed down through 5 generations of women who understood that marriage isn't just about love. It's about joining families, honoring the past, and building something that will last long after the flowers have wilted and the photographs have faded. Sarah didn't understand any of this. From the moment Michael announced their engagement, she'd been pushing to have the wedding at some fancy venue in Atlanta, complaining that our family land was too remote, too old-fashioned, too much trouble for her city friends to reach. But Michael had grown up dreaming of getting married under the same oak tree where his father and I had exchanged vows 32 years ago. And for once in his people-pleasing life, he held firm. So Sarah smiled and nodded and said of course she understood how important family traditions were, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes every time she looked around our property. She wasn't seeing the generations of love and labor that had built this place. She was seeing dollar signs. The second red flag came 3 weeks after the desk drawer incident, when I overheard her on the phone with someone she called Danny. I'd come back early from my grocery run in town because I'd forgotten my shopping list, and her voice was carrying through the open kitchen window where she was supposedly helping me plan the wedding menu. "The property's worth at least $400,000, maybe more if we can get it rezoned for development," she was saying, her voice lower than I'd ever heard it, more serious. "The old woman keeps all the important papers in that desk in the living room. I've seen insurance documents, property surveys, the whole works." I stood frozen by my own back door, grocery bags cutting into my palms, trying to process what I was hearing. The woman my son loved, the woman who was going to become my daughter-in-law in 5 months, was discussing our family property like it was already hers to sell. "No, he doesn't suspect anything," she continued. "Michael's completely trusting, probably too trusting for his own good. He thinks I'm just being helpful with the wedding planning. And the mother, well, she's suspicious, but she's also old school. She won't say anything to her precious son that might hurt his feelings." That last part stung because it was partially true. I would do almost anything to protect Michael's happiness, even if it meant swallowing my own concerns. He'd been through enough heartbreak in his 31 years. His father's sudden death from a heart attack when Michael was 25 had left him devastated, and it had taken years for him to trust in love again. When he brought Sarah home that first time, glowing with a happiness I hadn't seen since before James died, I'd promised myself I wouldn't interfere unless I absolutely had to. But listening to her talk about my family like we were marks in some kind of con game, I realized that moment might be coming sooner than I'd hoped. I spent the next hour unpacking groceries with shaking hands, trying to decide what to do with what I'd learned. Part of me wanted to march right back into that kitchen and confront her. But the part of me that had been protecting my children for 3 decades knew I needed more information first. Accusations without proof would only drive Michael away and make Sarah more careful about hiding her real intentions. So I started paying closer attention. I started noticing things, like how Sarah always found excuses to go through our mail when she visited, claiming she was just tidying up. Like how she asked detailed questions about our neighbors' properties during casual conversations, always framing it as interest in the community she'd be joining. Like how she'd grown increasingly insistent about modernizing our wedding traditions, starting with the cake. The wedding cake was where I decided to make my stand. In our family, the wedding cake isn't just dessert. It's a ceremony unto itself, prepared with ingredients that have been blessed by 4 generations of women who understood the spiritual significance of nourishing the people you love. The recipe includes honey from our own beehives, eggs from our chickens, flour ground from wheat we've grown in the back 40 for as long as anyone can remember. The cake is prepared in the 3 days leading up to the wedding, with different family members contributing different elements, and it's blessed at sunrise on the wedding day by the oldest woman in the family. Right now, that's me. Sarah wanted to order a cake from some fancy bakery in Atlanta. She said our traditions were quaint, but not sophisticated enough for the kind of wedding she'd always dreamed of. She wanted multiple tiers, professional decorating, flavors like lavender honey and champagne buttercream that had nothing to do with our family or our land. "It's just more practical, Mrs. Henderson," she said one afternoon in late April, her voice taking on that patient tone people use when they're explaining something to a child. "My friends are expecting a certain level of presentation, and honestly, homemade cakes can be so unpredictable. What if it doesn't turn out right? What if it falls? I'd just die of embarrassment." What she didn't say, but what I heard clearly, was that she was embarrassed by us, by our traditions, by the life Michael had grown up loving and wanting to share with her. "The cake has never fallen in 5 generations, I told her, keeping my voice steady, even though my hands were trembling with anger. "It's made with love and intention, not just ingredients. That's what makes it special." She laughed, that same musical laugh that fooled everyone else, but I was starting to hear the edge underneath it. "Oh, Mrs. Henderson, you're so sweet. But love doesn't really make cake rise, does it? That's what baking powder is for." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that laugh, about the way she'd dismissed something that meant everything to me like it was just superstition. I found myself walking through the house at 3 in the morning, touching the things my family had built, wondering if I was fighting a losing battle. In the morning, I called my sister Patricia in Tennessee. Patricia had always been the practical one, the one who could see through people's pretenses without getting emotionally tangled up in the mess. I told her everything: the desk drawer, the phone call, the cake argument, the growing certainty that Sarah wasn't who she claimed to be. "Honey," Patricia said after I'd talked for 40 minutes straight, "you know what you have to do. You have to find out who this girl really is before she destroys your boy's life." "But how?" "I'm 63 years old, Patricia. I don't know how to investigate people." "You know how to protect your family. You've been doing it your whole life. Trust your instincts and start asking the right questions." So that's what I did. I started with small things, casual inquiries that seemed like normal getting-to-know-you conversation. Where exactly had she grown up? What were her parents' names? What high school had she attended? Could I contact her family about coordinating wedding plans? The answers were always vague, always deflected with jokes or subject changes. Her parents were very private people who didn't like to be bothered with wedding details. Her childhood was nothing special, just a typical small-town upbringing. Her high school friends had all scattered to the wind and wouldn't be coming to the wedding anyway. It was Emma, Michael's 28-year-old sister, who helped me connect the dots. Emma had always been sharp, maybe too sharp for her own good sometimes, and she'd been watching Sarah with the same quiet intensity I had. "Mom," she said one evening in May while we were cleaning up after dinner, "something's off about Sarah's stories. She told me she grew up in a small town in North Carolina, but last week she mentioned going to high school in Virginia. When I asked her about it, she said she'd moved around a lot as a kid, but her details don't line up." "What kind of details?" "Little things. She said her dad was a mechanic, but then she mentioned him working in an office. She said she'd never been to Disney World, but then she referenced riding Space Mountain like she'd been there multiple times. It's like she's mixing up different backstories." That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to hire a private investigator. I know that sounds dramatic, like something out of a soap opera, but I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't shake the feeling that my family was being targeted, and I couldn't protect Michael if I didn't know what we were really facing. The investigator's name was David Chen, and he came highly recommended by our family lawyer. He was quiet and thorough, the kind of man who noticed things without making people uncomfortable. I met him at a coffee shop in town and told him everything I suspected, everything I'd observed, every instinct that was screaming at me that Sarah wasn't who she claimed to be. "I need to know who she really is," I told him, my hands wrapped around a coffee cup to stop them from shaking. "I need to know what she really wants, and I need to know before my son marries her in 3 months." David nodded and took notes, asking questions I hadn't thought to ask. What was Sarah's full legal name? What information had she provided on the marriage license application? Did she have any visible scars or tattoos that might help with identification? Had she ever mentioned specific places or people from her past in unguarded moments? "Mrs. Henderson," he said as we wrapped up our meeting, "I have to ask, what are you prepared to do with whatever information I find? If your suspicions are correct, if this woman is running some kind of long-term con on your family, are you ready to hurt your son to protect him?" That question haunted me for weeks. Was I ready to break Michael's heart to save him from something worse? Was I ready to be the villain in his love story if it meant protecting him from a bigger betrayal down the road? As it turned out, I didn't have to decide. The decision was made for me 2 weeks later when David called with news that changed everything. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice careful and professional, "I think you need to sit down for this conversation. Sarah Morrison isn't who she says she is. In fact, Sarah Morrison doesn't exist. The woman my son was going to marry in 10 weeks didn't exist, at least not on paper." According to David Chen's investigation, there was no birth certificate, no school records, no employment history for anyone named Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, born 26 years ago in North Carolina. The Social Security number she'd used on their apartment lease belonged to a woman who had died in infancy in 1998. I sat in my kitchen, staring at the manila folder David had handed me, feeling like the floor had disappeared beneath my feet. Inside were photographs of the real Sarah Morrison's gravestone, copies of fraudulent documents, and a trail of false identities that stretched back at least 5 years. The woman living in my son's apartment, planning our family wedding, sleeping in his bed every night, was a complete stranger. "Her real name appears to be Rebecca Chen," David continued, and I noticed he'd paused before saying it, like he was giving me time to absorb each piece of devastating information. "No relation to me, despite the surname. She's originally from West Virginia, and she has a criminal record." "What kind of criminal record?" My voice sounded like it was coming from someone else, someone much older and more fragile than I felt inside. "Identity theft. Fraud. She served 18 months in prison 3 years ago for running a romance scam that targeted widowed men in rural communities. She would research their backgrounds, their financial situations, their family structures, and then create elaborate false identities to gain their trust." The room started spinning. I gripped the edge of my kitchen table, the same table where I'd taught Michael to do his homework, where James and I had planned our budget every month, where 4 generations of my family had made decisions that shaped our lives. Now, I was sitting at that same table, learning that everything I'd feared about Sarah was worse than I'd imagined. "Mrs. Henderson, there's more." David's voice was gentle but insistent. "Rebecca Chen didn't choose your son randomly. She specifically targeted your family after researching property records and obituaries in this area. She knew about your husband's death, your family's financial situation, and the value of your land before she ever made contact with Michael. How did she meet him? I asked, though I was starting to suspect I already knew the answer. The coffee shop where they supposedly met by accident. She'd been going there every day for 2 weeks, watching his routine, learning his schedule. She engineered their entire relationship from the first conversation. I thought about all the times Michael had told the story of how they met, his face lighting up with the memory of Sarah spilling coffee on his laptop and then insisting on buying him a replacement drink. How they'd talked for 3 hours about books and movies and their dreams for the future. How he'd known immediately that she was special, that she was different from all the other women he'd dated. She was different, all right. She was a professional. What does she want? I asked, though I already knew the answer to that question too. Your property is worth considerably more than you might realize. The land alone is valued at close to $600,000. But if it were sold to developers, it could be worth twice that. She's been researching zoning laws and development opportunities in this area for months. $600,000. $1,200,000 if developed. I thought about Sarah's phone conversation, about her casual mention of $400,000 like she was lowballing even her own estimates. She'd done her homework better than I'd given her credit for. There's something else, David said, and I braced myself because I wasn't sure how much more devastating news I could process in one afternoon. Rebecca Chen is pregnant. The words hit me like a physical blow. Are you certain? I have medical records from a clinic in Atlanta. She's about 3 months along, which means... He paused, doing the math I was already doing in my head. The conception would have occurred before she started dating your son. Before. The baby Michael was so excited about, the grandchild I'd been cautiously starting to dream about, wasn't his. The pregnancy that had accelerated their wedding timeline, that had made Michael more determined than ever to provide a stable, loving home, was just another lie in Rebecca Chen's elaborate deception. I sat in that kitchen for 2 hours after David left, staring at the evidence spread across my table, trying to figure out how to destroy my son's life in order to save it, because that's what this was going to do. When Michael learned that the woman he loved didn't exist, that their entire relationship was a calculated fraud, that the baby wasn't his, it was going to devastate him in ways I wasn't sure he'd recover from. But the alternative was letting her destroy him more slowly, more completely. Letting her manipulate him into selling our family land. Letting her trap him in a marriage built on lies. Letting her raise another man's child while bleeding our family dry, financially and emotionally. I called Patricia first, because I needed to hear my own voice saying the words out loud before I could figure out what to do next. "Oh, honey," she said when I finished telling her everything David had discovered. "Oh, my sweet Lord, that poor boy. How are you going to tell him?" "I don't know if I can tell him. Patricia, he's going to be destroyed. After everything he went through when James died, after all the therapy and the depression and the years it took him to trust in love again, this might break him permanently. And if you don't tell him? If you let him marry her?" I closed my eyes, trying to imagine that scenario. Michael signing over property rights to his new wife. Rebecca Chen slowly isolating him from his family, the way manipulators always do. Discovering her true identity after they were married, after she had legal rights to our family assets, after the lies had become even more complicated to untangle. "I have to tell him," I said, and started crying for the first time since I'd gotten David's call. "But I don't know how. What about Emma? Would it be easier coming from his sister?" I thought about that. Emma and Michael had always been close, closer than most siblings I knew. She'd been his rock after James died, spending hours on the phone with him, driving down from Atlanta every weekend to check on him. If anyone could find a way to deliver this news without completely destroying him, it would be Emma. But was it fair to ask her to carry this burden? Was it fair to make her the messenger in a situation that was going to explode our family dynamics, no matter how carefully we handled it? "I need to think about this," I told Patricia. "I need to figure out the right way to handle it. How much time do you have?" "The wedding is in 10 weeks. But Patricia, she's living in his apartment. She's around him every day. Every day I wait is another day she's manipulating him, another day she's getting deeper into our family business." That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about all the conversations I'd had with Rebecca, All the times I'd sensed something was wrong, but talked myself out of trusting my instincts. I thought about the way she looked at our family photographs, like she was memorizing them for some purpose I couldn't understand. I thought about her questions about our neighbors, our community, our local history. Most of all, I thought about Michael, my sweet, trusting son who had inherited his father's generous heart and his tendency to see the best in everyone. How was I going to explain to him that his capacity for love had been weaponized against him? The next morning, I made a decision that probably wasn't wise, but felt like the only option I had. I decided to confront Rebecca directly before involving Michael or Emma. I needed to look her in the eye, to see if there was any part of her that was real, any possibility that her feelings for my son had grown beyond whatever calculating motives had brought them together. I waited until Michael left for work, then drove to their apartment complex. I'd been there dozens of times for dinner, for game nights, for the casual family gatherings that had convinced me Rebecca was becoming part of our family. Now I was seeing it differently, noticing things I'd missed before. The way she'd always been the one to answer the door, controlling the first impression. The way she'd guided conversations away from topics that might reveal inconsistencies in her story. The way she'd positioned herself as the grateful outsider being welcomed into a loving family, when really, she was a predator studying her prey. I knocked on the door at 9:30 in the morning, knowing she'd be home alone. She opened it wearing one of Michael's old college t-shirts and a confused smile, like she couldn't imagine why I'd be there without calling first. "Mrs. Henderson, what a nice surprise. Michael just left for work, but come in, come in." I was just about to make some tea. She was good. I had to give her that. Even knowing what I knew, even seeing her through the lens of David's investigation, she still seemed like the sweet, slightly scattered young woman who'd won my son's heart. If I hadn't seen the evidence with my own eyes, I might have convinced myself I was being paranoid. But I had seen the evidence. I knew who she really was. "Rebecca," I said quietly, watching her face as I used her real name. She froze for just a moment, her hand still on the door handle, and I saw something flicker across her features before she composed herself. Fear, maybe, or calculation. "I'm sorry," she said, tilting her head with that same confused smile. "I think you might have me mixed up with someone else. Rebecca Chen, from West Virginia. 18 months in prison for identity theft and fraud. 3 months pregnant with a baby that isn't my son's." The transformation was instant and complete. The sweet, confused expression disappeared, replaced by something cold and sharp that I'd never seen before. This was the real woman, the one who had studied my family like marks in a con game. "Well," she said, closing the door behind me with deliberate calm, "I was wondering when you'd figure it out. You're smarter than I gave you credit for initially. Why my son? Why my family?" She walked to the kitchen and put the kettle on, moving with a confidence I'd never seen from Sarah. This version of her was efficient, controlled, completely comfortable in her own skin. "Because you were perfect," she said, not bothering to look at me. Widowed mother, grieving son, valuable property, tight-knit family with traditional values. You were exactly the kind of people who would welcome a lost soul with open arms, especially if that lost soul was carrying your grandchild. The baby isn't his. No, but he doesn't know that. And he's so eager to be a father, so desperate to build the family he lost when your husband died. It was almost too easy. The casual cruelty in her voice made my hands shake. This woman had studied my son's grief, his vulnerabilities, his deepest desires, and used them against him. What was your plan? After the wedding? Convince him to sell this place and move somewhere more practical for raising a family. Maybe North Carolina, maybe Tennessee. Somewhere far enough from here that you couldn't interfere, but close enough that he wouldn't feel like he was abandoning you completely. Once we had the money from the property sale, well, accidents happen. Young fathers can be so reckless when they're stressed about providing for their families. I felt sick. She wasn't just planning to steal from us. She was planning to destroy Michael completely, maybe even physically. "You're insane if you think I'm going to let you hurt my son." She turned around then, and her smile was genuinely amused. "Mrs. Henderson, what exactly do you think you can do? Tell Michael his pregnant fiancée is a criminal? Show him evidence that proves the mother of his child is a fraud? How do you think that's going to affect him mentally? You've seen what grief did to him when his father died. What do you think this kind of betrayal will do? She was right, and we both knew it. Exposing her would devastate Michael, but letting her continue would destroy him more slowly and more completely. Besides, she continued, who's going to believe you? I've been the perfect girlfriend, the perfect daughter-in-law to be. I've been sweet and helpful and grateful for your family's acceptance. If you start making accusations now, 10 weeks before our wedding, you'll look like the jealous mother-in-law who can't let go of her son. Emma will believe me. Emma already thinks you're being overprotective. She told me so herself last week when I mentioned how concerned you seemed about our wedding plans. She said, you've always been a little possessive of Michael, especially since your husband died. My own daughter had been turned against me. Rebecca had been more thorough than I'd imagined. So here's what's going to happen, she said, pouring hot water into 2 teacups like we were having a normal conversation. You're going to keep your mouth shut, smile at our wedding, and accept that your son is going to have a different life than you planned. You're going to be a loving grandmother to my child, and you're going to support Michael's decisions about our future together. Because if you don't, if you try to sabotage this relationship, you'll destroy him yourself. She handed me a cup of tea, her movements graceful and controlled. And Mrs. Henderson, I have backup plans you haven't even considered yet. People in your community who owe me favors, information about your family that could be very embarrassing if it became public, connections that run deeper than you realize. What does that mean? It means you should be very careful about how you choose to handle this situation. Very careful indeed. I left that apartment knowing I was in a war I wasn't prepared to fight. Rebecca Chen had spent months, maybe years, planning this operation. She had contingencies I couldn't imagine, allies I didn't know about, and the advantage of having nothing to lose. But she'd made one critical mistake. She'd underestimated how far a mother would go to protect her child. That afternoon, I called Emma and asked her to come home for dinner. I called Patricia and asked her to drive down from Tennessee. I called our family lawyer and asked him to review our property documents. And I called David Chen and asked him to keep investigating, to find out exactly what backup plans Rebecca thought she had. Because if she wanted a war, I was going to give her one. And I was going to make sure my son survived it, even if it meant becoming the villain in his love story. Even if it meant risking everything I'd spent my life building to save him from losing everything that mattered. The wedding was still 10 weeks away, but the real battle was just beginning. The next 10 weeks passed like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Every family dinner, every wedding planning session, every moment I had to sit across from Rebecca and pretend I didn't know who she really was felt like swallowing glass. But I kept my mouth shut because David Chen was still investigating her backup plans, and I needed to understand the full scope of what we were facing before I made my move. What he discovered was worse than I'd imagined. Rebecca hadn't just targeted my family randomly. She'd been living in our community for almost 2 years before she made contact with Michael, using a different identity, working as a part-time nurse's aide at the assisted living facility where several of our elderly neighbors lived. She'd been collecting information about local families, their histories, their financial situations, their weaknesses. Mrs. Peterson, who lived 2 miles down the road and had always been one of my closest friends, had been sharing family stories with sweet little Amy, the nurse's aide, for months. Stories about how the Henderson family had been struggling financially since James died. Stories about how worried she was about my health, living alone in that big house. Stories about how Michael was such a good son, but needed someone to take care of him. Rebecca had known everything about us before she ever spilled that first cup of coffee. But worse than that, she'd been building relationships with people in positions of trust. The loan officer at our local bank who had access to our financial records. The county clerk who handled property transfers. Even Pastor Williams at our church, who had agreed to officiate the wedding and who Rebecca had convinced that I was struggling with empty nest syndrome and needed gentle guidance about letting my children live their own lives. She'd been poisoning the well for 2 years, making sure that when the time came, no one would believe anything I said against her. Emma came home 3 days before the wedding. and I could see immediately that something was wrong. My daughter had always been strong, independent, the kind of woman who faced problems head-on. But she looked exhausted, worried, like she'd been carrying a burden she couldn't share. "Mom, we need to talk," she said as soon as she walked in the door, her voice tight with stress. We sat in the living room, the same room where Rebecca had been going through James's desk that first day, and Emma told me what she'd discovered during her own investigation of our soon-to-be family member. "I've been asking questions in Atlanta, talking to people who might know Sarah from before. Mom, nobody knows her. The apartment she said she lived in before moving here? The landlord has no record of anyone by that name. The job she said she had at the marketing firm? They've never heard of her." I felt relief and terror in equal measure. Relief that I wasn't alone in my suspicions, terror that the situation was even worse than I'd understood. "There's more," Emma continued. "I hired someone to look into her background, and Mom, the woman Michael's planning to marry doesn't exist. Her real name is Rebecca Chen, and she has a criminal record." I stared at my daughter, realizing that we'd been conducting parallel investigations without knowing it. "Emma, I already know. I've known for weeks." "What? And you didn't tell me? You didn't tell Michael?" I confronted her. She threatened our family, threatened to destroy Michael if I tried to expose her. She said she had backup plans, people in our community who would support her story over mine. Emma's face went white. "Mom, what kind of backup plans?" I told her everything David had discovered about Rebecca's 2-year infiltration of our community, about all the people she'd manipulated, all the relationships she'd carefully cultivated to ensure that she'd have credibility when she needed it. "She's been planning this for years, Emma. And she's pregnant with another man's baby, but Michael thinks it's his." My daughter sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing the scope of the deception. Finally, she looked up at me with tears in her eyes. "We have to tell him. We have to tell him right now, before the wedding. If we tell him, it'll destroy him. You know what losing your father did to him. This would be 10 times worse. If we don't tell him, she'll destroy him anyway, just more slowly." We both knew she was right. The question wasn't whether to tell Michael the truth. The question was how to do it in a way that didn't completely shatter him. That night, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life, no matter how it turned out. I decided to let the wedding proceed, but to expose Rebecca during the ceremony itself, in front of everyone, in a way that would make it impossible for her to manipulate the narrative afterward. It was a calculated risk that could backfire spectacularly. If I was wrong about any detail, if Rebecca had covered her tracks better than I thought, if the evidence wasn't as solid as David believed, I would humiliate my son on his wedding day and destroy our relationship forever. But if I was right, if I could expose her in front of witnesses, with proof, it might be the only way to save Michael without giving her the chance to disappear and start this scam all over again with some other family. The morning of the wedding, I woke up before dawn and went to the kitchen to begin preparing our family's traditional wedding cake. 5 generations of women had performed this ritual, blessing the ingredients, infusing the cake with intentions of love, prosperity, and protection for the new marriage. This time, I was baking it with different intentions entirely. As I measured the flour that had been ground from wheat grown on our own land, I thought about Rebecca's dismissive comments about family traditions. As I gathered eggs from our chickens and honey from our beehives, I thought about how she'd tried to replace this meaningful ritual with some store-bought cake that had no connection to our family, our land, our history. This cake was going to be our family's last stand. Emma found me in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, tears streaming down my face as I worked. "Mom, what if we're making a mistake? What if there's another way?" "There is no other way, sweetheart." She's thought of everything, planned for every contingency. The only advantage we have is the element of surprise, and we can only use that once. "What exactly are you planning to do?" I told her about the moment I'd chosen, about the traditional blessing that happened right before the cake cutting, about the opportunity it would give me to speak to the assembled family and friends with the authority that came with being the family matriarch. I'm going to tell them who she really is. I'm going to show them the evidence. And I'm going to pray that seeing the truth laid out in front of witnesses will be enough to snap Michael out of whatever spell she's cast over him. Emma was quiet for a long time, helping me measure ingredients, both of us lost in our own thoughts about what was going to happen in a few hours. "Mom," she finally said, "what if it doesn't work? What if he chooses her anyway?" I'd been asking myself the same question for weeks. What if love really was blind? What if Michael's need to believe in their relationship was stronger than the evidence of Rebecca's deception? Then we'll have to live with knowing we tried. And we'll have to hope that someday he'll understand why we did it. The morning flew by in a blur of last-minute preparations. Flowers were arranged, chairs were set up under the oak tree where James and I had been married, caterers arrived with food for the reception. Rebecca looked radiant in her white dress, playing the part of the blushing bride to perfection. Michael looked happier than I'd seen him since his father died, and that broke my heart more than anything else. He was glowing with anticipation, talking excitedly about their honeymoon, about the baby, about the life they were going to build together. In a few hours, I was going to destroy all of that happiness. I was going to be the person who shattered his dreams, who turned his wedding day into a nightmare he'd remember for the rest of his life. But the alternative was letting Rebecca destroy him more completely, more permanently. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Pastor Williams performed the service under our family's oak tree, with the afternoon sun filtering through the leaves, just the way it had 32 years ago when James and I exchanged vows. Rebecca said her lines perfectly, looking deeply into Michael's eyes as she promised to love, honor, and cherish him for the rest of their lives. Every word was a lie, but she delivered them with such conviction that I almost believed them myself. When they kissed and were pronounced husband and wife, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Michael was beaming, Rebecca was glowing, and everyone was talking about what a perfect couple they made, how happy they looked, how lucky they were to have found each other. The reception began with dinner, speeches from Michael's college friends, toasts from family members who had no idea they were celebrating a complete fabrication. Rebecca played her part flawlessly, laughing at jokes, thanking everyone for their support, gracefully accepting congratulations and advice about married life. As the evening progressed, I found myself second-guessing my plan. Maybe I was wrong about everything. Maybe my suspicions and David's investigation had led us down a rabbit hole of paranoia. Maybe Rebecca really did love Michael, despite how their relationship had started. But then I caught her checking her phone during the father-daughter dance that Michael was sharing with his new mother-in-law, and I saw something in her expression that reminded me exactly who she was. Calculation, impatience, the look of someone who was enduring this performance until she could get to the real business at hand. When the time came for the cake cutting, I stood up and called for everyone's attention, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid people could hear it. "Before we cut the cake," I announced, my voice surprisingly steady, "I'd like to share the story of this family tradition and perform the blessing that my grandmother performed for me and her grandmother performed for her." This was part of our normal ceremony, so no one thought anything of it when I asked the bride and groom to join me beside the cake table. Rebecca looked slightly annoyed at the delay, but she smiled and took her place next to Michael, playing the respectful daughter-in-law for just a few more minutes. "This cake," I began, looking out at the assembled family and friends, "represents the foundation of marriage. It's made with ingredients from our own land, blessed by generations of women who understood that marriage isn't just about two people falling in love. It's about honesty, trust, and building something real together." I paused, making eye contact with David Chen, who was standing at the back of the crowd with a manila envelope in his hands. He nodded slightly, confirming that he was ready. "Unfortunately," I continued, my voice getting stronger, "this marriage is built on lies." The crowd went silent. Rebecca's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered, but I saw the flash of panic in her eyes. "Mrs. Henderson," she said with a nervous laugh, "I think you might be getting a little emotional. Maybe we should just cut the cake." "The woman my son married today," I continued, ignoring her attempt to deflect, "is not Sarah Elizabeth Morrison. Her real name is Rebecca Chen, and she is a convicted felon who has been running a long-term con on our family." The silence was deafening. Michael was staring at me like I'd lost my mind. his face cycling through confusion, embarrassment, and growing anger. "Mom, what the hell are you doing?" he said, his voice low and furious. "Saving your life," I replied, then nodded to David, who began walking forward with the envelope of evidence. Rebecca made her move then, the mask finally slipping completely. Instead of continuing to play the confused innocent, she grabbed the knife we'd been about to use for the cake cutting and held it defensively. "Don't come any closer," she said, her voice completely different now, harder and more dangerous than anyone had ever heard it. The crowd started murmuring, confused and frightened by the sudden change in atmosphere. Michael reached for Rebecca, trying to calm her down, but she stepped away from him. "Rebecca," I said calmly, "it's over. Everyone needs to know the truth." "The truth?" she laughed, but there was no music in it anymore. "The truth is that your precious son was pathetically easy to manipulate. The truth is that your entire family was so desperate for someone to love that you welcomed a complete stranger with open arms. The truth is that I could have taken everything you have, and you would have thanked me for it." Michael stood frozen, finally beginning to understand that something was very, very wrong. "The baby isn't yours," Rebecca continued, looking directly at him with cruel satisfaction. "I was already pregnant when I met you, but you were so eager to play daddy, so desperate to replace the family you lost, that you never even questioned the timeline." That was when Michael broke. I watched my strong, kind son crumble as the full weight of the deception hit him. The woman he loved didn't exist. The baby he'd been planning for wasn't his. The marriage he'd just committed to was a complete fabrication. Rebecca saw her opportunity in his devastation. While everyone was focused on Michael's collapse, she grabbed her purse and headed for the parking area, still holding the cake knife. But I'd anticipated this possibility too. Sheriff Martinez was waiting by the cars, along with 2 deputies and an arrest warrant based on David's evidence of identity theft and fraud. The last thing Rebecca said before they put her in handcuffs was directed at me. "You've destroyed your own son to stop me. How does it feel to win?" She was right in a way. I had destroyed my son's happiness to save him from something worse. The question was whether he'd ever be able to forgive me for it, and whether he'd ever be able to trust love again after this betrayal. The wedding guests dispersed in shocked silence. The reception food went untouched. The flowers wilted in the evening heat while we dealt with police reports and legal procedures. Michael didn't speak to me for 3 months after that night. Emma later told me that he'd spent weeks blaming me for destroying his chance at happiness, convinced that I'd manufactured evidence because I couldn't let him go. It was only when Rebecca's accomplices were arrested, when the full scope of her operation was revealed in court, when he saw the medical records proving the baby wasn't his, that he began to understand I'd saved him from something that would have destroyed him far more completely than the truth ever could. The reconciliation was slow, painful, and incomplete. We rebuilt our relationship one careful conversation at a time, both of us learning to trust each other again. Michael went back to therapy, working through not just the betrayal by Rebecca, but his complicated feelings about my role in exposing it. But we survived it. Our family survived it. A year later, Michael met someone new, someone real, someone whose background checked out, whose stories were consistent, whose love for him was genuine rather than calculated. When they got married 2 years after the disaster with Rebecca, they used our family's traditional cake recipe. As I performed the blessing that my grandmother had taught me, speaking about honesty and trust and building something real together, I saw tears in Michael's eyes. Afterward, he hugged me tighter than he had since he was a little boy. "Thank you," he whispered in my ear. "Thank you for saving me, even when it meant I'd hate you for it." The secret behind that first wedding cake wasn't just Rebecca's deception. It was a mother's willingness to become the villain in her son's love story in order to protect him from a far worse ending. Sometimes love means letting people make their own mistakes, but sometimes it means being strong enough to stop them from making mistakes that will destroy their lives, even if it means they'll never forgive you for it. I was prepared to live with Michael's hatred forever if it meant he lived at all. The fact that our family found its way back to each other was a blessing I never expected but will treasure for the rest of my life. And every time I bake a wedding cake now, I remember that the most important ingredient isn't flour or eggs or even love. It's truth. Because without truth, everything else is just sugarcoating a lie that will eventually crumble. Some secrets are worth keeping, but some secrets will destroy you if you don't find the courage to expose them in time. The cake I baked for Rebecca's wedding was the last one I ever made with the intention of preserving a lie. Every cake since has been blessed with the hope for authentic love, honest partnerships, and the kind of courage it takes to build something real together. That's the true family tradition I want to pass down. Not just the recipe for cake, but the recipe for truth.